I really appreciate the opportunity of being here tonight, and this is my first talk after the book came out, so it's a real thrill. The book is a labor of love and some pain. If anybody's ever done a book in this room, there's nothing worse than a copy editor. There's almost no archaeology on the sugar mills. Most of the archaeology that has been done at sugar mills has been done in support of structural evaluations. But then at the same time, sugar mills don't have much in the way of artifacts. You get architecture items and sometimes pieces of tools. People did not live at sugar mills, so you're not getting the really cool stuff that you get from houses. So what you're going to get tonight is a brief history, a very brief history of sugar, a much lengthier discussion of how sugar was produced prior to the Civil War, and then a quick tour through the sugar works. Let's see if I can make this work. Sugar first appears in India about 2,000 years ago. It was primarily used as a medicinal product, although it was used as a sweetener. By 1,000 years ago, it had reached the Middle East, and from there the Crusaders took sugar to Europe, where it remained a product used by the very rich, again, primarily for medicine. By the 1450s, Spain and Portugal dominated the sugar industry in Europe, particularly with their sugar-growing plantations in the Canary Islands and Madeira. In the early 1500s, they were responsible for bringing sugar to the New World, including to St. Augustine, where there was probably some sugar produced, but the Spaniards in St. Augustine did not put much emphasis on plantations. So sugar really didn't get produced on any scale in Florida until the British period of 1763 to 1783. The British very much liked the idea of plantations. It continued during the Spanish and territorial periods and up to the Civil War. During the Spanish and territorial periods, it was produced in East Florida, primarily in Volusia and Flagler counties, and up into Duval County, and in a stretch from Tallahassee down to Alachua County. After the Second Seminole War ended in 1842, sugar began to be produced in Marion County and southwest Florida, including Yulee's Plantation in Homosassa Springs and the Gamble and Braden Works in on the Manatee River. Big problem with sugar in Florida is war. In 1835, the Seminoles burned all of the sugar mills in East Florida, totally destroying them, as well as most of those in Central Florida. The Civil War burned what was left in West Florida. Sugar did not revive until the late 19th century when Hamilton Diston started draining the Everglades of South Florida. And then, by then, sugar was a much more sophisticated operation, highly mechanized. The big sugar mills you see now in areas like Clewiston with U.S. Sugar. Sugar is basically a grass. It grows up to 20 feet tall. It roots from the nodes where the leaves spring out. And it can reproduce from the same nodes several years in a row, but the quantity of syrup drops from year to year. The most common sugar cane grown in Florida and southeast Georgia was probably ribbon cane. It's a little tougher in terms of resistance to disease and cold. The trade-off is the stalk is thicker, so it's harder to crush, and it has less juice because the stalk is thicker. In Florida, sugar is usually grown in hammock areas prior to the Civil War because the soils were lighter and drier. In the Caribbean, it's often grown in wetland areas, as it is now in South Florida. It can be planted in rows or in squares, as you see on the right side of the screen. You dig a furrow about 4 or 5 inches deep, and you put 2 joints from the tops of mature cane stalks, and you put 2 in case one of them doesn't sprout. It takes about 9 to 18 months to mature. It's usually planted at the same time that you're harvesting the existing crop. While it's growing, it takes minimal care. It was estimated that one slave could take care of 2 to 5 acres because you just have to do some occasional weeding and mulching. It's harvested in the fall before it freezes, and at that time all hands on the plantation are involved because you've got to cut it and process it very, very quickly. The tops are cut off, the unripened joints are cut off, and the leaves are cut off, and then it's severed at the root with something called a cane knife, which is similar to a machete. Then it's carted to the mill. After the harvest is completed, the fields are frequently burned to get rid of anything that's left. A sugar mill or a sugar works is a fairly complex system. It's actually an agro-industrial complex. You had to have a mill to crush the cane, a boiling house, a purgery where the molasses drains out of the sugar. You might have a storage building for the crushed stalks, which are called bagasse. They can be used for animal food, or they can also be used for fuel for the sugar works. You might have a distillery for rum. Slave quarters were usually near the fields rather than the sugar works, possibly in order to protect the product. The process consists of 4 steps. You have the crushing or grinding process. You have clarifying, in which the syrup is basically cleaned of whatever residue is left from crushing, and that's also the point at which you test for the saccharin level of the sugar. Clarifying, they sometimes add lime to the juice to make things precipitate to the top where they're skimmed off, and then the juice is drained out of the bottom of the clarifier. And then you have boiling, where the juice is boiled down until it crystallizes. And then the purgery is where you drain the molasses out of the sugar, leaving sugar and molasses. Crushers began as vertical crushers. They originally consisted of 3 vertical wooden rollers with a drive shaft at the top. The middle roller is the power roller. Then they fluted a little later they started fluting the surfaces of the rollers so they would grasp the cane better. Then they found if they covered them with cast iron, they were stronger and heavier. And finally, they used cast iron rollers for maximum crushing power. The sugar is fed between the primary rollers and then sometimes fed back through a second time so that you make sure you've gotten all the juice. There's a plate at the base of the crusher where the juice is collected. The vertical crushers are animal-powered or sometimes wind and water-powered, particularly in the Caribbean. In the late 18th century, horizontal crushers were invented, and usually in conjunction with steam power to run the crushers, because you're talking about several thousand pounds worth of roller. And they frequently had these slatted belts that fed the cane in and then removed the bagasse or crushed cane when it came out. And the top is a contemporary drawing of 18th, 19th century cane crushing. Pretty hectic, and you do not want to get your arm caught. The tale is that they kept a machete hanging next to the crusher for an obvious reason. Now, once it's clarified, you have your boiling. The boiling house started as just a simple shed like this with a roof so that you could continue if the weather got bad. The clarifier, as I said, is the first step where the sugar, the cane juice, is sort of cleaned of whatever's left from crushing. And then you go to the boiling train. The first trains were Spanish trains. In a Spanish train, each kettle has a separate furnace, and there's no chimney. The sugar is ladled from one kettle to the other, starting at the biggest kettle. The kettles get progressively smaller. And they were named the Grand, the Flambeau, the Sirop, and the Battery or Teche, which is the smallest kettle. Then they invented the Jamaica train. The Jamaica train is more fuel efficient, but the heat is a little more difficult to control. With a Jamaica train, you have one furnace that's under the smallest kettle because you want that one to be the hottest kettle. And then there's a chimney at the opposite end, so the heat is drawn from the furnace under the other kettles and out the chimney. Now, because this isn't terribly efficient in terms of heat, you'll see in the sugar trains that I'll show you later, a lot of them have supplemental furnaces under some of the kettles to maintain the heat. And you can see the process in the drawing on the bottom. As the kettle in Florida, Jamaica trains generally have 5 kettles. The Caribbean did have trains with 7 to 9 kettles, but I don't know of any in Florida. As the sugar syrup boils, it's skimmed, again, for impurities, and it thickens as it goes from kettle to kettle, and it's ladled from kettle to kettle. You can see the bucket in the drawing that they dip to ladle it. In the final kettle, it will start getting very thick, and you'll see the sugar starting to crystallize, and that's the point at which they determine that it's ready to go. At that point, they take it out of the small kettle and put it in the cooling pans, which are usually wooden boxes. And while it's in the cooling pan, they agitate it, and it stays there for about 6 to 14 hours until crystallization is complete. Then it goes to the purgery, and this is where the molasses and the sugar are separated. Initially, they used cone-shaped molds, as you see here, and they have a hole in the bottom for the molasses to drain out of, and when they're through draining, they just plug the hole. Later, they used cisterns, and in this particular one, you can see the slanted floor so that the cistern doesn't have to be as big as the building, and you put your barrels on boards with spaces between the boards. The hole in the barrel goes in over the space, obviously, and the molasses will drain down the sloping boards into the cistern. When you're finished, well, the purgery is in a separate building or room, and it's kept warm because if it's warm, the molasses precipitates out better. When you're finished, the sugar grades from darkest at the top of the container, lightest at the top of the container to darkest at the bottom where it's still got the most molasses. With the cone-shaped molds, they sometimes used a paste of white clay and water on the top of the mold and poured water through that, and as it trickled down, it whitened the sugar a little bit more. It takes about 3 weeks for purging. A hogshead or barrel produces about 40 to 45 gallons of molasses and about 1,000 pounds of sugar. The sugar is not white sugar like you have on your table. It has to go from there to a refinery to be whitened, and most of the refineries were in Europe. The end product, sugar, molasses, and rum. Rum distilling can be done with either the raw cane juice or with the molasses. It's combined with skimmings from the boiling or with yeast in order to create fermentation. And sometimes they add acid and lime or vegetable ash to help the process along. This fermented syrup is known as wash. Once it's started fermenting, it's put in the pot still, which is this one. And then the doubler, which is this one, has what's called low wine, which is drawn off from either the beginning or the end of the distilling process, and it's basically a low-proof rum. Both are heated. As the vapors pass from the pot still through the gooseneck into the doubler, the low wine will start boiling faster, and the alcohol vapors will be stronger, and then they go out into the coil, which is put in a container of water to keep it cool so that the vapor will then turn into a liquid and come out as rum. As it comes out, it's 130 to 150 proof. You can drink it that way, or you can color it and age it. A 1,000-gallon distillery yields about 500 gallons of rum in about 15 hours. 10 gallons of that is called low wine. Now we'll go on a flying tour of sugar works, mostly in East Florida because that's the area that I studied, but I did pick up a little bit on Yulee and Homosassa Springs and the Gamble plantation on the Manatee River because you people are on the Gulf Coast. I divided my sugar works into 3 groups. The first ones are the Spanish trains, remember, with no chimney. Then there are the adaptive ones. Adaptive partly because they're changing how the train is built and or they're changing how the mill is powered. And then you have the fully evolved trains, and both Yulee and Gamble's plantation would fall into the fully evolved category. And these are where the ones that are in my book are located. They're all but one of them is in Volusia County. Bulow at the top is in southeastern Flagler County. They are all publicly owned. Most of them are open to the public. The exception would be McCarty and McCrae, which are in the jungles of Tomoka Basin State Park. You have to have a ranger to get to them. This is Oswald Swamp Settlement, and for this tour of the sugar mills, I'm kind of going to hit the highlights so that it doesn't get too repetitive. The first few I'll talk about in a little more detail, but then it'll become repetitive, so we'll just hit the interesting things. Oswald, this project began with Richard Oswald in the British period. Oswald was a wealthy British merchant. He acquired 20,000 acres in East Florida. He never came to Florida. However, his good friend, Governor Grant, was a silent partner, and the governor managed his properties. He separated his 20,000 acres into 5 plantations, each of which had a particular product it was supposed to produce, for instance, rice, indigo, and at the swamp settlement, sugar. He brought a sugar maker from Jamaica to build his sugar works and operate it. And then he abandoned it at the end of the British period. The chimney that you see in the background has nothing whatever to do with the sugar works. The chimney is a 20th century feature. You'll see what it comes from in a few minutes. This is the furnace side of the sugar works. This sugar works was recently restored, so it looks a little different now. The next owner, Henry Young, attempted to revive the sugar works during the Second Spanish period, but he had 3 slaves, I believe, and no money. You can't do that on a sugar plantation. He failed. It was never used for sugar again. In the 20th century, William Fagan built this building on top of the sugar works. This is the sugar works down here. And that is his building, which he operated as some sort of a tourist trap. This is on the main street in Ormond Beach. And this is what you have at the swamp settlement. You have the sugar train. This is a Spanish train, no chimney. And you have a distillery. Oswald planned on making rum. The mill here was probably a vertical mill. It was probably located somewhere here. There's no evidence for it. The purgery was probably a building somewhere on the property. We don't know where. It may have been a frame building because the only descriptions we have are for frame buildings. The sugar train and the distillery may not have been in buildings at all. As you can see, each one, where it says flues, each one of those is a furnace. And the Grand is the biggest of the sugar boiling kettles. So you would have started at the Grand. And this is what you have today. This is after, the 2 top pictures are after restoration. The bottom one is before restoration. This sugar works is brick. It's one of the few in East Florida that is brick. The bricks are interesting. They're what most people would classify as clinkers or waster brick. They're kind of twisted and crude, but they took the sugar builder took advantage of the twisted shapes to use them to hold the round kettles. And this is looking down the train. I believe this is looking toward from the Grand to the smaller end. And this is one of the flues. This is the only one that had its iron flue lining left. And there's a grate here that the fire was built on, and the ash would fall down into the bottom and could be cleaned out. This side, this is the opposite side of the train. The holes in the brick were to support a wooden platform for the workers to stand on while they ladled sugar from kettle to kettle and skimmed the sugar. It may have had a roof. We don't know. There's not much evidence. There has been some archaeology at this by Ted Payne, architectural material, and that's about it. This is what's left of the distillery. In the late 19th century, the chimney was still standing. The distillery does have a chimney, and it had 2 flues, one for each part of the distillery, the pot still and the doubler. The chimney, unfortunately, now is here. This too is primarily brick, although there are cut coquina blocks on the corners. Most of you are probably familiar with coquina. It's a stone that's basically made of shells. It's soft when you cut it, but it hardens in the air. And it's very commonly used in East Florida. This may be what that sugar works look like. Here you have the train, the crusher, and this is the distillery. There is another Spanish train in East Florida. It's somewhere in the Cape Canaveral National Wildlife Property. It is not open to anybody, public researchers or anybody else, because they don't have the manpower to protect it, so they don't want anyone to know where it is exactly. McCarty is sort of a transition between a Spanish train and a Jamaica train. This also began as a British grant. It may have been a sugar plantation during the British period. We don't have much information. John McCarty owned it during the territorial period, but an 1823 description of his property makes no mention of sugar or sugar works. So we don't think he was doing sugar, but we don't know. After his ownership, it probably was never used for sugar. McCarty is a fairly small site. It consists of the train. You can see the kettles, and there are only 4 of them, again like a Spanish train. And there are closed-in flues, bricked-in flues on this side of the train, which supports the idea that it may have started as a Spanish train. This is a well, by the way, and this was probably an enclosed room. And this is what's left of the chimney. At some point, a chimney was added. And we know it was added because it's not connected to the coquina of the rest of the train. And this train is built of coquina, although the kettles are lined with brick. You don't want to build fires right on coquina. You probably would have a disaster. These are Barry's Premium Fire Bricks. They are present in the flue that goes to the chimney, and they're in the chimney. These appeared at Dummett Plantation, which you'll see shortly. They also appeared at the McIntosh Sugar Works in southeast Georgia. Archaeologist James Ford identified them as being made by William Barry in Georgia sometime after 1819, which gives us a target date for when this was modified to be a Jamaica train, or when the chimney was added, sometime after 1819, which would be in McCarty's ownership. As I mentioned, there's a large well. The well is right here. This lip supported the workers' platform. So you're talking about a very narrow platform for these slaves to be standing on dipping sugar. We do not know where the purgery or the mill were here, the crusher. The crusher was probably another vertical crusher. Dummett gets us into the adoptive sugar works. This again began as a British grant, Rosetta. John Bunch, owner in 1804, may or may not have produced sugar, but he did not build this building. We know that it was built by Thomas Dummett, who acquired 2,000 plus acres and 90 slaves from Bunch, and he hired a Scottish engineer named Reuben Loring to build his sugar works. And we know a lot about this one because Loring ended up suing Dummett over payment and various other things, including complaints that Dummett kept changing what he wanted built and that he didn't provide the right materials, and he didn't pay his bills, which seems to be a recurring issue with Dummett. Dummett was from Barbados. He was probably familiar with sugar in the Caribbean when he came to Florida. This mill is built of coquina. Dummett brought his own steam engine with him, and this is not it, but this is probably what he had. It was probably a vertical engine and fairly small. He claimed it was the first one in Florida. His steam engine is located actually outside the building. This is where the steam engine sat here, and this is the furnace for it, which puts the crusher somewhere out here. And this is the building. The contract specified 7 kettles, which is the description used for furnaces. So that would be a 5-kettle train, plus he had a distillery. This is one of the few that was making rum that we know of. It had 2 wells. Again, you see how close the well is to this train. Now this one may have had changes. Well, we know the building had a lot of changes, but the train may have changed. The smallest kettle was added at some point, and there are also bricked in flues on this side, indicating that there were furnaces on this side of the train. So this may have started out as a Spanish train, but then he's got these chimneys, one of which was a later addition. So at some point, he added a kettle, added a chimney, and made it a Jamaica train before it operated. It's built of coquina and bricks that were fired on the property. The other thing that he asked for, and this is pictures, he asked that the wall be raised higher and that the chimneys be taller. And as I said, one of the chimneys is a later addition, the one for the distillery, which may mean he added his distillery later. There are more flues on the outside of the building, the chimney side. They would be down in this area. So he had to have supplemental fires. There are Barry's premium fire bricks in these flues. So after 1819, again. We're not sure where the perjury is. Anna Dummett, Dummett's daughter, described 3 cisterns with boards across them between the distillery and the sugar works. Well, you see the distillery is in the building, so they're not between the building and between the sugar works and the distillery. She described this because she fell into them one time. We're not sure where they were. The area has never really been surveyed very well. Presumably they're someplace around the building. There is a room behind the building, but it's very small. It doesn't appear to have a cistern. It probably provided access to the flues. We're kind of assuming that Anna Dummett's description is the reminiscence of a child and that she may have been a little confused about where they were, even though she did fall in them. The other interesting thing about Dummett is the wall behind the distillery and behind the train has this series of filled-in arches. Architect Herschel Shepard tells me that these are to help support the weight of the masonry above the arch. The building also has buttresses on the outside probably because the height was raised. Dummett was the epitome of experimentation and adaptation. Reese Spring Gardens is adaptive in the sense of the source of power for the sugar works, a water wheel, the only one that I know of on a Florida sugar works. They're quite common in the Caribbean, but this is the only one I've seen in Florida. This is a restoration of the wheel for the waterworks, but it's a duplicate of the original. This was probably built by Orlando Reese. Woodruff wanted to build a sugar works. He went to New York to get equipment, which is where most people got their iron equipment, died on the way back, and the plantation was abandoned by his heirs. So we know Reese built the watermill because in 1832, John James Audubon, the bird painter, came here with an unnamed engineer who had been working at Bulow Plantation in Flagler County to help Reese out with his sugar works. The engineer looked at De Leon Springs and said, waterworks. So he dammed the spring, built a spillway to divert the water, and built the water wheel. It obviously worked because Reese reported that he had sufficient cane to manufacture 90 hogsheads of sugar, about 9,000 pounds. It was destroyed in the Second Seminole War, then rebuilt by Thomas Stark, who in 1850 produced 2,500 pounds of sugar per year, he claimed, which is 500 pounds more than the state average at the time. But he abandoned the property prior to the Civil War, and sugar was never reinstated, although the mill was rebuilt and was used for a grist mill, and I believe for cotton, if I remember correctly. It's a little difficult to interpret this site. This is a pancake restaurant that's built on top of the part of the sugar train. The tall chimney is original. That is the sugar train chimney. The small one is part of the pancake house. The water wheel sits on this side of the pancake house. The spring is behind the building. And the train extends, what you can see of the train extends out here. I'm told it's a great pancake house. You cook your own pancakes.
I can attest to that.
Okay, this is what's left of the train. Ted Payne did excavate the train, but it's been rebuilt several times, as I mentioned. It's hard to tell where the furnace was. It's hard to tell where the workers' platform was. Part of it is underneath the pancake house. This is a side view of the water wheel. We know it was a 5-kettle Jamaica train because of the huge chimney. The chimney is pretty typical of the sugar works. You'll see the same tapering shape at most of the other ones. The firebox would have been down here, and the chimney's here. We don't think there was a masonry building. This is an 1885 picture, and you can see the frame building that has the water wheel here, and here's your sugar train over here. So the mill was separate from the train. Fully advanced sugar works, Bulow, which is probably the epitome of the fully advanced sugar works. Charles Bulow was an interesting person. He was a rich Charleston merchant. He acquired ultimately 6,000 acres, which he called Bulowville, and intentionally was going to develop a sugar plantation. He had 1,500 acres planted in sugar, 1,000 in cotton, other acreage in indigo and rice, and he had as many as 300 slaves. But he died 3 years after acquiring the property. His son, John, was a miner at that time, living in Paris where he was in school. He came back to Florida, operated the property with his trustees until he came of age. John built a main house, 2 kitchens, 2 cotton houses, the sugar works that you see. He had an ark of 46 slave cabins. It's one of the only arks of cabins we know. Kingsley Plantation in Duval County has an ark. He built a sawmill, a corn house, stables, other outbuildings, and a boat slip, which he lined with empty wine bottles, which we won't question where those came from. Bulow was on really good terms with the Seminoles. In 1835, when the Second Seminole War started, Major Benjamin Putnam and the Florida militia showed up to fortify Bulow's plantation. Bulow objected. He even fired a cannon loaded with powder at Major Putnam. Putnam, as a result, imprisoned Bulow in his own outbuildings and set up his fortifications. When the property was abandoned by Putnam, taking Bulow and his slaves with him, the Indians burned it in revenge. Bulow returned to Paris, where he died a year later. The Bulow heirs filed claims for damages to the plantation. Those claims were rejected because he had resisted Putnam. It was never restored as a sugar plantation. In fact, it was never really a plantation again. Bulow is a big building. In fact, it's 2 buildings. You have an engine house, you have the boiling room, and you have 2 purgeries, and then you have this room in the middle that was actually 2 stories that was used to move things from one space to the other. And again, according to John James Audubon, Bulow had this unnamed Scottish engineer working on his sugar works in the early 1830s. It's a coquina. It was probably plastered on the outside. Many coquina buildings are. The purgeries are probably the largest in East Florida. And this is what you get. This is the engine house, which has its own chimney and a firebox. The engine house was a 1.5-story gable roof building. He actually had his steam engine, may have also powered his sawmill grist mill. This is, whoops. This is his boiling house. Bulow is stabilized, not restored. And this is the chimney for the boiling house, which is taller than that for the engine house. This is the battery or tesh, the smaller end of the train. The larger end is up there, and the clarifier would have sat next to the chimney. This is the space in between the purgery and the boiling house, and you note the nice arches. The boiling house probably had nice arched windows too. And while they're very beautiful and very decorative, Herschel Shepard tells me they're a very practical way of putting a hole in a masonry building because an arch is a very strong construction. As you can see, it had 2 stories. We don't know whether the whole building was 2 stories or just the space. And this is one of the purgeries, which also had nice, beautifully arched windows. And there were 2 cisterns in each purgery, as you saw on the plan. This is a spring house that sits close to the sugar works. It's partially submerged. It probably had a wooden gable roof. We're getting rained on. Bulow is a fully evolved sugar works. It's very similar to what you see in the Caribbean. It's very similar to what you see after the Second Seminole War. McRae is another fully evolved sugar works. McRae was also the scene of a Second Seminole War event, in fact, a little skirmish. It was also destroyed by the Seminole. It probably only operated for 3 years. There used to be a stone over the door that said it was built in 1832. It was burned in 1835 or January of 1836. It's one of the largest in East Florida. It's 135 feet long, which is 40 feet longer than Bulow, but it does only have a single purgery. And it's narrow. You have your engine complex here. The chimney would have been somewhere in this area and would have served both the engine and the train. You had a 5-kettle train, and this is the firebox for the train. And you have sort of your moving things around the area and your purgery. It was a single-story building. This part probably had a gable roof. This had a gable roof. This may have just been open with a shed roof. And it too was coquina, which was plastered. And in fact, the plaster was scored to look like cut stone. It's hard to take pictures at McRae. It's in the jungle. This is one that you have to have a ranger to get you there, and a good 4-wheel drive vehicle. But in this case, here you are looking down the train toward the move around area. You're looking back the other direction. It's in pretty bad shape, and no stabilization has been done because it's not open to the public and it's not really accessible. This is the exterior wall of the train. This is the firebox, and this is one of the windows. See the big hole? That's very recent. A land surveyor was surveying property lines, and rather than work around the building, they knocked a hole through the wall. This is, the engine house has a series of walls to support the machinery, and it's pretty clear when you examine them that they did not finish the walls until the machinery was in place so that they would have a perfect fit. This is the well. It's actually octagonal, and it's coquina, as you can see. It's right next to the chimney, basically. This is the purgery. It's a pretty small cistern for such a big building. But if you'll remember the drawing that I showed you at the beginning with the sloping boards going down to the small cisterns, that's probably what you had going on here, where the floor that held the barrels was actually quite a bit bigger than this small cistern. I hope you can still hear. This building obviously represented an extensive, expensive investment and project. They were seriously planning on making a lot of sugar here. But war intervened. This is Kruger de Preister. It's probably the most romantic of the remaining sugar works because of these beautiful arched windows. It's in New Smyrna Beach, and it is open to the public. It was developed by Henry Kruger and William de Preister, who borrowed money from William Kimball, a lot of money from William Kimball. He also borrowed money from Joseph and Charles Lawton. They built their sugar works in 1832. It was destroyed in 1835. They still owed all their money at that point. After the war, Kimball sued to get his money and forced a public auction, at which point he acquired the building for $4,000. He promptly sold the machinery to John Marshall, who was building nearby rebuilding nearby Dunlawton Sugar Works. But that's not where the interesting history ends at Kruger de Peyster. In 1893, Washington Connor bought this property, 10 acres containing the sugar works, as a gift to his wife, Jeanette. Jeanette considered herself an expert on Spanish missions. She was convinced that because of the arched windows, this could not be a sugar works. It had to be a Spanish mission, even though none of the Spanish missions were masonry, except in St. Augustine. But she was convinced. A man named Charles Coe and archaeologist John Griffin published a pamphlet clearly demonstrating that this was a sugar works. There were public records of Kruger and de Peyster building it. Ms. Connor, who was an influential lady, managed to get it put on the National Register of Historic Places as a mission. And the National Register still calls it a mission. It has similarities to both McCrae and Bulow. It's L-shaped like McCrae, but in reality it's closer to Bulow. You have a separate engine house, you have your boiling house, your space for moving things around, and the purgery. The difference between this and Bulow is there's only one purgery. Bulow had another one over here. It's the standard 5-kettle train with your firebox. The chimney is in the area for moving things around. This space is where the clarifier sat. We assume that the crusher would have been here someplace or here, because this is your steam engine and you want your crusher close to where you're going to boil things. This building, while it has these beautiful graceful windows and it's masonry and it's big, it's not well constructed. The masonry is poor to the point that there are cracks all the way down the walls. There were iron supports installed in the arches soon after it was built. Whoever built this one wasn't that expert. These are some views. This is the sugar train here, looking towards the space where you move around. The engine house would be over here. This is the firebox for the sugar train. These are two of the arches in the space between the rooms. Both of them have iron supports. You can see the damage. And this is that space. The chimney is, what's left of it is here. And this is a firebox for the chimney. You're looking toward the sugar train, and the purgery is through this door. And this is the purgery. The tree has since been removed. Trees and masonry do not do well together. You can see the damage in the masonry. This was all plastered, and the cisterns are plaster lined. This is the engine house. The chimney for the engine house steps in at this point before it continued up. And this is some of the support machinery walls for the machinery. This is another view of the engine house with the beautiful arched windows. It's a very popular place for weddings. There was another room next to the engine house, probably for storage. This is Dunlawton, the only one of the, well, Reese Spring Gardens was restored after the Second Seminole War, and Dunlawton is the only one of the fully advanced sugar works that was restored. The first owner, Dean, grew sugar. He was killed by Indians in 1818, and the property was abandoned until it was sold to the Andersons in 1832. Mrs. Anderson and her sons hired John Mitchell and Thomas Hall to build a sugar plantation for them, including a dwelling, overseer's house, kitchen, cornhouse, landing, boathouse, lumber house, workshop, flat house, slave cabins, and coquina sugar works. After the Second Seminole War, John Marshall rebuilt it using the equipment that he obtained from Kruger de Peyster Sugar Works. By 1851, Marshall was producing 200 tons of sugar, but he didn't really operate it after that year. Ultimately, parts of the gears ended up at a shipyard in Daytona Beach, and one of the boilers for the steam engine ended up at a boatyard in New Smyrna Beach. And the kettles were used to boil salt during the Civil War, so it never really was a sugar works after the Civil War. in 1963, when J. Saxton Lloyd, 1940s, when J. Saxton Lloyd obtained it, he and Dr. Sperry Sperber developed Bongo Land as a tourist destination with life-size concrete dinosaurs and a botanical garden, both of which are still there. It failed, so he sold it to the county, and it is now operated as a botanical gardens, and you can see the dinosaurs. This is what Dunlawton looked like at its prime. This is the engine and the engine chimney. This is the engine room. This is a passageway where the crusher sat. This is the boiling room. The vent is over a room that is between the boiling room and the purgery, which is the last room. The purgery was probably wood, but the whole thing was under a single roof, and everything up to the purgery was coquina. It has 2 sugar trains. The first one, we think, is this one. You see it only has 4 kettles. It may have started as a Spanish train under Dean's ownership, but then when the Andersons built it, or rebuilt it, and added the second train, they turned this into a Jamaica train with a chimney. And this is your chimney. It's a clarifier. This is a space for another clarifier. Your engine and boilers are here, crusher here. This is the room between the boiling house and the purgery. Very, very big building. These are views of the engine house. One of the boilers does remain, and a number of parts of the engine and the crusher. The boiler had flues that ran to the chimney. This is the flues. This is the firebox on the other side of the chimney. The crusher is still there, as are some of the wheels. These are wagon stops, probably where the bagasse wagons waited for the crushed cane. This has been restored, obviously, and very recently it was re-roofed, so it looks very different from these pictures. This is the smaller train, the 4-kettle train, and what's left of the clarifier. You can see the supplemental flue on the outside wall. It had windows. This is the 5-kettle train. Because the 5-kettle train was further from the chimney, there's a very complex system of flues under the floor between this train and the chimney. However, you see all the flues on the outside of the train. It must not have worked too well because these are all fireboxes for this train. And this is the purgery, which is actually divided into 3 cisterns. Very large building. Now we'll come to the ones that I actually know the least about, which is your Gulf Coast sugar mills. After the Second Seminole War, sugar shifted to Marion County and the Gulf. Yulee built this one. David Yulee is an interesting character. His name is actually David Levy Yulee. He was the son of Moses Levy. He was born in the Caribbean. He grew up in the Caribbean after his parents' divorce, which is a very shocking thing for the early 19th century. But he did spend some time on his father's Florida plantations where Moses Levy attempted to produce sugar. So between his Caribbean upbringing and his time in Florida, he would have been very familiar with sugar. Soon after his marriage, and sometime before 1851, he acquired 5,100 acres near Homosassa Springs, which he called Margarita. He bought it to grow cotton and sugar. And he built a very luxuriously furnished mansion on Tiger Tail Island, which is about 2 miles from the sugar works. He did all this with about 100 slaves. He was successful. At one point, he was producing 19,000 pounds of cotton in a year. And it was reported in 1863 that he produced 92.5 tons of sugar, which seems like a very high amount for the middle of the Civil War. So I suspect that may be an accumulation of several years' worth that was smuggled out of the area on blockade runners. In 1864, the federal schooner Ariel came up the Homosassa River and burned both his mansion and his sugar works. It was not revived after the war. John Donne, the late 19th century owner, was one of the people who was instrumental in establishing Citrus County, and he actually platted the city of Homosassa Springs. This is a pretty small sugar works compared to what you saw in the fully advanced sugar works in East Florida. This whole thing is the boiler. And you can see it still has its crusher. It's built of lime rock because this is the Gulf Coast, not the East Coast, so you have lime rock. All the metal, the crusher, the engine, the boiler, came from Novelty Iron Works in New York, which is was a big manufacturer of bits and pieces for sugar works. This may not have been an entirely masonry structure. There's not a lot of evidence for masonry walls around it. It may just have had masonry for the equipment and then a wooden building. There has been some archaeology done here. This plan is a result of that archaeology. This is a view of the end of the boiler. It's a huge boiler, and this is the train. There were things when I visited the site a couple of weeks ago that I kind of questioned how they labeled them. They called this the cooling vat. If you remember back when I was talking about sugary, cooling vats are when you first dip it out of the train and it's still kind of liquid, and they were shallow wooden pans. This is not a shallow wooden pan, as you'll see in the next slide. It's about a meter deep masonry structure. I suspect it's the cistern for the purgery. The other thing is they said that the sugar crusher was on the second floor. I doubt it. First of all, this does not appear to have been a two-story building. Secondly, why would you put that much weight up that high where you have to get the cane up to it and the crushed cane back down? It probably sat just where it sits today, which is at slightly above ground level. This is the firebox for the train. This is what they label a cooling pan. I'm pretty sure it's the cistern for the purgery. Gamble. Robert Gamble was from a family of Tallahassee planters and bankers, although they were kind of failed bankers, but they grew sugar in the Tallahassee area, so he knew about sugar. In 1842, at the end of the Second Seminole War, you have the Armed Occupation Act, which offered free land if you developed it. So Gamble and Braden and a number of other Tallahassee area planters moved down to the Manatee River, claimed their land, and decided to become sugar planters. He succeeded. In 1849, he had a frame sugar works. He claimed he produced 40 tons of sugar and 4,000 gallons of molasses. Unfortunately, before he could take it to market, the whole thing burned down. He rebuilt it in brick in 1851. He said he had a 50 horsepower engine for the crusher, an 8 horsepower engine for his grist mill and sawmill, 2 sugar trains, as you can see, a purgery with 2 cisterns. A couple of years later, he added this building, another cooling house, and purgery. He also had some really new technology. These are vacuum pans. They were invented in Louisiana. They expedite crystallization of the sugar. He also had something called a Hurd centrifugal draining machine, which precipitates molasses faster. So he was on top of the newest technology. In 1855, he produced 151 tons of sugar and 12,680 gallons of molasses. This was the most in Florida at the time. But he was $190,000 in debt to Louisiana sugar planters Cofield and Davis. In 1856, he returned to Tallahassee for family reasons, and 3 years later, Cofield and Davis foreclosed on him and took over the property. In 1864, the federal schooner Stonewall came up the Manatee River specifically to destroy sugar works. They broke up all the equipment that they could break, set loaded shells in the building, set it on fire, boom. We think this drawing is of Gamble, obviously after boom. As you can see, there are a lot of different ways to build your sugar works. The system is the same, but you go from very simple Spanish trains to steam and water to very sophisticated buildings. They were heavily influenced by the Caribbean sugar works and by sugar planters in Georgia who had started doing sugar works somewhat before Florida. And there's a Scottish engineer theme that runs through all of it, probably because Scottish engineers knew how to operate steam engines. But they didn't really succeed well in Florida. Why? These are Louisiana sugar works. They're pretty massive. They were well underway when Florida was just getting started. When we were at war with the Seminoles, Louisiana was doing this. Tough competition. The Caribbean sugar had been going on since the early 16th century on a grand scale. It wasn't until Hamilton Distance drained the Everglades that Florida took the lead in sugar. Well, I don't even know that we have the lead. Louisiana probably still has the lead, as does Cuba. To give you a comparison, in 1700, Barbados was producing over 23,000 tons of sugar. Florida, none. 1820s in Louisiana, 33,000 tons a year. Florida, minimal. 1853 Louisiana, a quarter of the world's sugar. Florida. At the same time, Cuba was producing 60% of the sugar consumed in this country. All of this when sugar prices are falling. Florida sugar planters had to be the most optimistic people on the face of the earth to think they could deal with this. And sugar is a rich man's occupation. Not only do you need the land, the right land that will grow sugar, you need slaves, buildings, expensive equipment that is not manufactured in the South, skilled sugar makers, draft animals, money to support the whole thing until you can take your crop to market. Most planters were heavily in debt, as you've heard. It was not successful prior to the Civil War in Florida due to the scale that planters here were operating on. Even Gamble, with his tons of sugar a year, wasn't even close to your average Louisiana sugar planter. The technology here was less advanced than what was used in Louisiana. Louisiana had evaporator pans while we were fighting the Seminoles. Prices were falling, and we had the Seminole War and the Civil War to destroy our sugar works. Thank you. I'd be glad to.